Cape Town property owners might just have scored one of the biggest municipal victories in years. But this High Court ruling, how will it affect you? Will it just simply affect your monthly bill? Let's unpack this and understand exactly what the latest High Court ruling for Cape Town Municipality means. The recent High Court ruling, it could reshape affordability, investor confidence, municipal funding, and even the future cost of owning property in South Africa, not just in Cape Town. So it's pretty significant. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, quite recently, the Western Cape High Court ruled that parts of the city of Cape Town's tariff structure were unlawful. We need to understand what it is, how this will impact property owners, but also, investors, landlords, tenants, and just the greater property market, because changes like this, litigation like this, changes in the way that the city bills, these have significant impacts. They could potentially move, certain costs from owners to landlords, as an example. It could affect the way that the property is valued just by simply increasing its expenses. So we'll unpack this and look at exactly what actually happened. I think there's been a lot of talk. When you mention it to someone, and when we speak amongst ourselves, everyone knows that there was some form of ruling, but I don't think they really understand what, the whole discussion was about. So I think first off, let's simplify this issue. What actually happened? So recently, the city of Cape Town introduced several fixed municipal charges, which were linked to property values, but rather than the actual usage. So these included a fixed water charge, a fixed sanitation charge, as well as fixed citywide cleaning tariffs. Now, many residents argued that these should not be linked to the value of their property. They should rather be billed according to consumption. SAPOA, the South African Property Owners Association, as well as AfriForum, challenged these in the court, and that's where this Western Cape High Court ruled that these tariff structures were unlawful, unconstitutional, and inconsistent with legislation and the city's own bylaws. So what does this ruling mean? It means that tariffs are currently set aside from the 30th of June 2026 unless they are overturned by a higher court ruling or replaced through a revised structure. Now, the city of Cape Town has already come out and said that they will not be appealing the decision, but that they will rather be re-looking at their revenue structure for the 26-27 financial year. What I thought I'd do is I'd take one of my own properties and have a look at the municipal account, maybe just show you exactly which items we are referring to. Okay, this is for a property that I own, and the due date was the middle of June, so it's the latest account. Let's quickly have a look. So a breakdown of how this municipal account works. You'll see the first section is your property rates. That's effectively your tax on the property ownership. And that rate is determined upon the value of your property. If you look at this particular property, you'll see that it's valued at 1,985,000 Rand. And then there's a calculation which is a rate in the Rand. So what they do is they take the value of your property, they times it by a rate which is applied, an annual rate, then divide it by 365 days and times it by the number of days in the month. And that's how your property tax or your rate is calculated. You'll see on this property for a 31-day period, it's 1,206 Rand. And then there's a rebate. This rebate is quite important. We're going to get to it just now. But what the rebate is effectively the first 435,000 Rand of your property value you are not taxed upon. So you'll see I get credited that amount of 264 Rand, and then my net rates is 942 Rand. So you can see that property rates, that calculation is heavily dependent upon the property value. If you increase the property value, as the city does when they have these valuation rolls and they reconsider the property values, then this will have a direct impact on the final rate figure, which is calculated. If you think logically about this, one of the ways that they could increase the rate would simply be by increasing the factor which they apply to your property value. So they don't just have the opportunity to raise it by revaluing your property, they may also review the rate which is charged, which is ultimately linked to the property value. So if that does ever increase in future, along with property values, one of the ones to watch out for, if you can follow where this discussion is going. Water, that's the next charge. You'll see that this property, the daily average was 0.3 kiloliters, and that the water is based upon consumption. So you'll see there's a calculation where there's 5 kiloliters, 5.9 kiloliters at a price of 21 Rand, and then a further 3 kiloliters at 29 Rand. That's based on a sliding scale. So that bill of 214 Rand for water is linked to consumption. But here, the first time we view one of these contentious issues, the fixed basic charge. And in brackets next to it, you'll see a valuation band of 1.75 to 2 million Rand. That's the property value. So because this property falls in the valuation category of 1.75 to 2 million Rand, the fixed basic charge for water is 77 Rand and 10 cents, irrespective of how much water is consumed. So while the actual water is being billed according to consumption, the fixed basic charge is dependent upon the value. So properties with higher values are paying more for the same connection, irrespective of how much they are using. The refuse bin is the next section. That's your solid waste removal. That's a fixed fee per bin, and that's not one of the charges being contested. The next one is sewage. Again, you'll see the sewage is linked to your water consumption because your water typically goes down the sewer. If you wash your hands, if you shower, wash dishes, most of this water actually ends up into the sewage network, and that's why your sewage disposal charge is linked to the actual consumption of your water. Now again, you'll see this fixed basic charge of 37 Rand and 72 cents for a property between 1.75 and 2 million Rand. That's the second charge besides rates that is linked to the value of your property. And then lastly, you'll see under sundries, you'll see there's a electrical service charge and the citywide cleaning fee. Now, the citywide cleaning fee is the other charge which is based upon the property value. And in this property, it's 60 Rand. So if you add those together, you come to about 175 Rand of fixed charges on this property. Now, you might say, well, Rowan, that's not really that significant. Remember, firstly, those are ex-VAT figures. So because these are consumption charges and not rates, they attract VAT. So you need to add VAT to that. And then it comes to about 200 Rand. If that 200 Rand was not there, this last municipal bill would have been 1,913 Rand rather than 2,113. And that's about a 10% difference on the municipal bill, simply by adding these fixed charges. That's without accounting for the additional value of the property or any increase in consumption charges. It's just simply by introducing fixed charges, it equates to 10% of the municipal bill. This is pretty significant if you take the scale of the rates and consumption charges that are collected by the city. So 10% of the bill, that's sort of more or less what it equates to on this example. And now we also need to understand why else, what other factors are there? Why are people so frustrated, especially in the commercial spaces, especially in the high value properties? I think that's where a lot of the emotion came from, because I think the sentiment was that the city is trying to tax the wealthy. They're just creating another form of taxation to subsidize the poor, which they would need to do to run the city effectively. But the manner in which they were doing it and the way in which these calculations were being done, I think that's what got a lot of people hot under the collar. So many property owners felt that these charges had very little relationship to their actual consumption, that they were disproportionately penalizing higher value properties, and that effectively it just became another disguised property taxation, being disguised as a service delivery charge. And this is quite an important point, because depending upon how those costs are categorized, the obligation to pay them, may very well shift. If, for instance, it is a consumption-based charge, your tenants would typically be responsible for it. Now, don't just think in cases where you have a home that's being rented out, or a single property to a single owner or to a single tenant in residential terms. Think about, major shopping centers, office blocks, where these fixed charges, which are being classified as service delivery charges, but are actually taxation, is being apportioned to either the tenant or the landlord. There was a lot of fighting and a lot of debate about this. So let me just give you one example of maybe a position that someone like SAPOA holds. This is the representative body for commercial and industrial sort of property ownership. Now, let's say a cost is designated to service delivery or consumption. This may very well affect who's responsible for that bill. Think about the amount. If you are managing a property portfolio, if you own a large corporate property portfolio like a shopping center, office blocks, or multiple properties combined, and that cost is now directed to you as owner rather than to the tenant, which may potentially have been the tenant's responsibility, or vice versa. Maybe a tenant responsibility, but it's now, because of how it's classified, moving towards the owner. There's a lot of debate, especially in income generating properties, because this has a dramatic effect to the bottom line, income generation. And income is used to determine the property values. So by changing these billing structures, it ultimately affects the value of the property. Now, that's on a larger scale, but let's just bring it down to sort of individual needs. So municipal costs are becoming more and more prevalent in the affordability calculation. Historically, buyers mainly focused on the purchase price, the bond repayment, and the interest rate that they would get on the property loan that they've applied for. But increasingly, you are seeing people looking at the municipal charges. Your municipal rates, your sanitation charges, water charges, electricity costs, and fixed service tariffs like we've just looked through. With the current billing system, this is becoming even more relevant because as you move up this property ownership value scale, the costs are not increasing linearly. They are increasing exponentially. I'll use a silly example. Say someone has started off in a home that was worth 1.5 million rand and they paid 1,500 rand rates and service charges. Now they've moved up to a 3 million rand home and they should be paying 3,000 rand if it was linear. In reality, they're probably paying 4,500 rand. Now they move on, they upgrade later in life to a property that's worth 5 million rand. Where if it was linear, they should be paying 5,500 rand, but that rates bill might be running 7,000 to 8,000 rand. That's what I'm talking about. So as you go up in the value chain, so the rates calculation becomes more and more relevant. So when making purchasing decisions, in some cases, municipal costs are starting to become just as important as the bond repayment itself. Now, this point is a major shift point in the property market. It's a way in which we view these costs and the way in which we consider them when making these purchasing decisions. So what happens after the 30th of June? If you've been following our conversation or read up yourself, you'd know that on the 30th of June, these fees, the city may no longer charge them. So now what happens after the 30th of June? This is probably the biggest question for Cape Town property owners right now. They're wanting to understand, well, what happens now? But it's important to that there's a clarification that this doesn't mean that your municipal bill suddenly disappears or that parts thereof, will no longer be charged. What will happen is you'll probably see these line items being removed from your bill, but this doesn't remove the city's need to generate revenue. It was actually respected in the court ruling. So Cape Town still needs to fund the roads, the water infrastructure, electrical infrastructure, refuse removal, sanitation services, and all general service delivery. So the most likely outcome is not that there's no more charges. The most likely outcome is that there will be a different charging structure. So then what is most likely to happen? If the city still needs to generate this revenue, but it may not be value-based anymore, I think one of the easiest ways for the city to reconsider this, and I think most analysts are saying this, is to re-look at the rate which they apply to your property value. So looking back at that example where I showed you the property bill, you would have seen that there's a very long decimal rate. Now that rate will probably be reviewed because that is linked to your property rates. So the city has already indicated, as I've said, that they will rather amend their budget and their tariff structures than abandoning this revenue collection altogether. So property value linked tariffs will disappear, but some other replacement structures will emerge. So the adjustment in the rate structures will probably be very similar in what it achieves, that higher valued properties will be taxed more. But it would be under the rates adjustment. Okay, so I think in summary, it's simply an adjustment in the rate structure. Other things that we could see introduced is higher usage-based tariffs, so where the usage of water, electricity, sewage, refuse removal, where these costs are simply upped. Flatter fixed charges, so you might see fixed charges that apply across the city, irrespective of property value, which is something that was called for, and other costs being introduced, increases elsewhere, which haven't yet even been identified. And this is important to understand, that the court didn't eliminate the city's need for revenue. It simply changed how they are allowed to collect it. And that's the real issue in this debate. And this leads to a bigger policy debate for the city of Cape Town right now, because this opens up a fascinating discussion of who should subsidize municipal infrastructure. The city previously argued that higher value homes effectively helped subsidize infrastructure and protect lower income homes. So if value-linked tariffs disappear, flatter charging structures may emerge, with some affluent homeowners paying less, while some middle or lower income households could ultimately pay more. And that becomes a major affordability and political discussion going forward, because municipalities still need to find sustainable funding models to ensure service delivery. So all these changes, what does it mean for the property market? Are there any hidden property market implications that we haven't yet identified? I think something that the interesting perspective is that I think it will become more and more prevalent in buyer behavior, where, under the previous structures, larger homes were more expensive to hold. Upward mobility, as we've discussed, became more and more expensive. As you were moving up that chain, it became exponentially more expensive. And luxury properties, their carrying costs were increased significantly. This was from about June 2025. So going into the new year, we may see that if these tariffs are reduced, high-end buyers may regain some confidence. Larger homes may become slightly more attractive again. Moving up that scale would become more attractive again. And holding costs could ease in certain segments. Investor confidence, that's another aspect that we need to look at. Investors want predictability, they want sustainability, they want transparency, and probably most of all, they want stability, because stability brings about that predictability. If there's any uncertainty surrounding municipal costs, tariff structures, utility charges, this can directly affect the investor sentiment as well as buying decisions. With existing property owners who need to think, how's this going to affect their rental pricing? Because they still need to protect their rental yields. So stable municipal billing is more important for investor confidence than what most people realize. Then the last one is this effect on the rental property market. Landlords have absorbed a lot of these costs because they have tried to protect the tenant. And I think the summary there is that landlords won't indefinitely continue absorbing those costs. So I know there was a lot of debate about who was responsible for a lot of these charges that were introduced. And in many instances, landlords simply absorbed those costs and decided to postpone dealing with it for another year. Now, whether those charges actually moved to tenant and whether they were lawfully moved and whatever is not up for debate now, because I think what will simply happen is that rental escalations would be higher to absorb those costs. And again, if there's another new billing structure that comes in from the city and these costs are simply reintroduced, I think it would ultimately just flow to the tenant, who's the consumer of these services. And in a rental market that's already showing some signs of being stretched, this becomes pretty significant. Then touching on why this has maybe gained so much media exposure outside of Cape Town too, is because this has national implications. The City of Cape Town ruling applies to other municipalities too, because there are many municipalities in South Africa that are financially strained. They're searching for additional revenue streams. They've introduced fixed charges or capacity charges. And this case could create a legal precedent, which could encourage further challenges from other municipalities. And, municipalities as a whole may need to rethink their funding and revenue models. So the ruling may ultimately reshape how municipalities across South Africa charge property owners. A question that then arises from my side is to say, well, could this accelerate off-grid living? I think this may be one of the most fascinating long-term implications, because as municipal costs keep rising, the viability of off-grid systems, whether it be electricity or backup, or water, boreholes, well points, even to a larger extent on certain developments where they have things like sewage package plants and things like this. All of these may become far more viable in an environment we have rising municipal charges. This is the great paradox, because as the more affluent homeowners reduce dependence upon municipal infrastructure, the greater the pressure becomes on the municipal revenue models. And it's a very interesting long-term dynamic. I think the most recent one that we've seen this happening to is Eskom, where a lot of people moved off-grid, a lot of businesses, a lot of individuals moved off-grid, and those that remain have to fund the infrastructure of delivering this electrical network. So it's probably the greatest paradox that there is in this conversation, but it's going to be interesting to see what happens there in the long term. As South Africans, we increasingly expect world-class infrastructure, reliable service delivery, and lower municipal costs. But the municipalities still need to find ways to fund all of this and to make their funding sustainable. Balancing those realities becomes one of the biggest property conversations in the country right now. So while this ruling may look like a simple billing dispute, it's actually a major conversation around affordability, fairness, infrastructure funding, and the future economics of property ownership in South Africa. So I'd be interested to hear your take on this. Do you believe that municipalities should charge residents based on property values or based on their consumption charges? Let us know in the comments, and stick around for more discussions like these on the Property Corner going forward.